Greetings, everyone. I wanted to touch base with you since we are not going to have a lot of lecture time in class. Next Thursday, I wanted to just do a special piece on the dynamic capabilities topic that we posted on my courses. This is an article that was published initially in 1991 and then came out with a final revision in 1997 by Thies, Pisano, and Schoen. And it's been cited probably nearly 40,000 times. So it's a pretty important article. We could give this conversation, we could have this lecture in a marketing course as well, because it really deals with a lot of elements related to positioning and market strategy. But it certainly fits into the context of organization systems change, and felt like it was really important for us to have a conversation. I won't, from a standpoint of how much of that article do you have to read, it isn't an overly technical article, but it is, it can wear you out. So if you read up to page 515, that would be sufficient, and really encourage you to read on if you are compelled to do so because you find it to be interesting. So I'm just going to kind of start with giving you a context of the different elements of. Let me see if I can get my clicker to work. Of dynamic capabilities. Let's talk about it in the big context. The big idea here is this: dynamic capabilities is, a contemporary view of how to analyze resources and methods to capture market share, while in the context of rapid technological change. And so we've, you can see that this was about a little over 20 years ago that this article was published. And we've certainly seen a lot of the outcomes of this kind of rapid technology change. And I wanted to give you a little bit of context about how it's played out over the course of the last 2 decades. So that's why it's important, or the big idea of it. Why it matters is, while it may not directly fit in the organization that you're working in, if you're in a slow-moving bureaucracy or a small business, you may not see this as much as you might see it if you were at Apple or some other innovative company that is quickly emerging and changing in the moment. So the big thing here, though, is that you're involved in it, whether you want to or whether you're aware of it or not. And so that's why dynamic capabilities plays out from a systems perspective. So Thies et al. Talk a lot about their lit review talks about a few different models before getting into the overview of dynamic capabilities. The first model that is presented is Porter's 5 forces model, which is a classic approach to competitive advantage, and almost looks at things as a closed system. So this was published in 1980. It's been extensively used in all sorts of business programs to talk about market and positioning. It's a system level view of competitive forces, and you can see it looks at the competitive rivalries within an industry. It talks about the threats of new entry, buying power of the individual consumer, threats of substitution, where companies can, where consumers may buy a different product that is similar to giving them the same satisfaction as the one that you offer. And then supplier power looks at the supply chain. So this can range from everything from thinking about how you can think about products that you use in your kitchen. Pancakes, for instance, would be a really good example. So when you think about buying Bisquick pancakes, if you're a pancake eater, which I am, you know that you can go buy an off-the-shelf version of that. And so Bisquick always has to compete with the idea that I may find a substitute for pancakes and make my own out from scratch. And so therefore I may have low buying power as an individual consumer because there's millions of people who buy pancake stuff. But by the same token, one of the threats is for me to take on making my own pancakes from scratch. And the supply power is pretty challenging because it's all commodity based. You have flour, and you have maybe sugar, but you have water, which is a easy commodity. So the supply chain is fairly efficient and very cheap. And then you have syrup, and there's numerous amounts of brands of syrup. And then the threat of new entry is certainly there are other products that can come into the system that may give someone, satisfaction based on them changing their preference for pancakes. So that's a simple example of how the Porter's model may work within a systems view. The second piece is that it is really looking at the aim to alter the firm's position within the industry. So how do I get more market share? How do we create more profitability based on how we meet the market? And so this was certainly a strategy that is still employed today for that purpose. The next one that Thies talks about is strategic conflict. And this was circa 1989, talking a little bit about this element. And so a strategic conflict really borrows from game theory and decision science. There are lots of articles that are very difficult to read in academia related to game theory. And I am not a game theorist, so I don't necessarily have any special competence in this level, but you can certainly find them if you're interested. But this really looks at finding equilibrium based on strategic behavior of what one rival believes another rival will do in a particular situation. No different if we were playing a chess match. And so this really sort of looks at competitive rivalry from what position do we take that is going to counter the position that one of our rivals takes. So one of the ideas that gets proposed in the article is Coke versus Pepsi and how they innovate their products. And this isn't necessarily looking at your organization as having a longstanding competitive advantage as much as it is about shifting your resources and your energy around innovation depending on what the competitor will do or already did do. And so this is really some of the strategic shifts that happen using strategic conflict. The third view, which I am a huge fan of, is RBV, or the resource-based view of the market or system. And so this is certainly widely used in all aspects of industry. And so this looks at, one of the quotes that I pulled out of here on page 513 is firms with superior systems and structures being profitable because they have lower costs or offer markedly higher quality or product performance. And really this is looking from the competitive advantage comes from the complexity of the product that you have, and that it's difficult for someone to imitate the resources that you bring to the marketplace. And so, you can look at things that are really easy to imitate, like restaurants. Everyone knows that they need a sandwich, and there's plenty of places that you can go buy a sandwich that are either franchised or individually, employed by an entrepreneur, or you can go and have a sandwich in your own house. But this looks at things that maybe are a little bit more complicated. So then you look at from a business development perspective, this looks at three assumptions. So business development is complex is the first one, and that is that you can't just generally start a new pipeline of recruiting new customers easily in a complex system. The second is that some assets are not tradable or they're difficult to imitate. And so the idea of intellectual property comes into play here, where you have something that you've patented or you found a copyright approach to protecting the asset that you've created, or you have expertise that maybe has been built up over a long period of time that is very difficult for another company to just pick up and start from scratch. And so and the third piece is that you're buying a capability buying this capability may not be generate a sufficient result. Meaning that if I have an engineering firm, just because I go and I want to compete against another rival engineering firm, just me hiring a bunch of people and putting them in place doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to be able to be have a competitive advantage over the firm that I'm competing against all the time. So this really makes those three assumptions, and really some of the examples that I pull out of this are that IBM, when you think about their evolution of technology, their buying power, the fact that they've been around for such a long time with regard to computing and technology, that it's really difficult for someone to make a quick shift to take away their market share. General Electric has they have a number of different industries that they've played in, particularly 15 years ago. And they also had a lot of intellectual property that was challenging to replicate. And then you think about folks like Pfizer Pharmaceutical. They had a product. They have patented something based on their research and development. And it's very difficult for another pharmaceutical firm to come in and undermine their product. And lastly is Walmart, when you think about the scale of that organization and how it has such a global presence, and how their lines of distribution and their motto of low cost every day is really hard to match, because they're such an effective buyer of products, and so they're able to always undercut the competitor based on price. So that's resource-based view of industry, and this is a more of a classic view. It's an older, more mature theory of how markets work. And then we go into dynamic capabilities. And so dynamic capabilities is a more contemporary view. And this looks at global market winners respond rapidly to innovation and process management abilities to coordinate and redeploy internal and external capabilities at warp speed. So this is kind of my paraphrasing of dynamic capabilities. But it's this idea that in a market, dynamic means renewed competencies to match a changing environment. And so this type of organization is always able to regenerate itself and scale itself based on having some unique capability. So the whole idea of renewal is that they're able to really scale their abilities. And then capabilities is to adapt and integrate their internal and external organizational skills to match the changing environment. And so this is the idea that they have some really unique capabilities. They've really identified and oriented and aligned their abilities in such a way that they're able to expand and contract as necessary based on what their market opportunity is. And so the key idea here is to identify difficult to imitate internal and external abilities that support valuable products and services. And so you think about rapidly changing systems and the technology and how rapidly it matures over and changes in a dynamic environment. And when you think about who may be winning this approach, I present to you that probably Amazon rises to the top, even above Google and Apple to some extent. So I've attached a YouTube here of one of their innovation leaders, and I encourage you, it's about a 5-minute video to kind of walk through it. But I also want to show you that there's, here's an Amazon map. And when you think of systems and you think about complexity and the archetypes that we've talked about this semester, when you look at Amazon and where they are in the marketplace, they've taken Amazon Prime, for example, which is the main portal or their web-based services, and how they've started to integrate how to go about getting home meals delivered to your home, how they've bought Fresh Market or Whole Foods rather, and they've integrated that into their market offerings, in addition to giving you access to all the different supermarkets for your shopping needs at home. Amazon Fashion, how you can buy almost anything through Amazon, and it's at your door quicker than you may be able to go to the mall and buy it. And then you have things like how they've taken on music and video, and they've really adapted and emerged in so many different categories that it would be very difficult for another firm to rapidly change their orientation to the market and have the same presence that Amazon has had over the course of the last decade. And so when you think about how fast they change, how innovative they are, how they've scaled their footprint, they're a very responsive firm. And that's not just because they have a lot of money to do so, but it's a mindset that they've taken about how they go about the market. And so I really encourage you to think about this as you read through the article, and hopefully this gives you some practical ways to think about how dynamic capabilities plays out, because there are certainly many other firms that we can talk about as an example. But when you think about Google, you see Google interfacing with so many parts of your life, whether it be how you get to your beach resort, all the way to how do I figure out how to clean my fireplace. And so Google has certainly played a huge role in how we go about our daily business, and it's been based on the idea that they are responsive to the rapid technological changes that happen inside of our environment as consumers and businesses, and it's made a huge difference in the way that we go about doing things. And so I think this plays out pretty commonly in how we live. So to wrap up, we'll have our guest lecturer this Thursday for sure. And then the week after, we'll have Journal 2 due. We'll talk about bases of power, and we'll also do a class simulation. So hope you all enjoy the rest of your weekend. And as always, feel free to call or shoot me an email if you have any questions.